Thanks, Sharice. Yeah, it was a pleasure to get her note last spring asking about this, and I've studied the Book of Judges a lot, so I was happy to come. I produced a series of little handouts that I hope all of you got. There's 3 of them back there, and I thought they were pretty impressive. Until I arrived this morning and saw this and began looking through this. And so I'd like to introduce Sharice, who's going to talk the rest of the hour. You're not coming up, Sharice. At the end, I want to talk. I have a little bibliography, which is one of the handouts, and I want to kind of talk you through some of that. If I'd known about this, I would have included on the bibliography. This looks really wonderful. It looks like you're going to have a great time this fall. So kudos to you for that. Okay. What to talk about, what to say about the Book of Judges in an hour. One of the things I often do in class is ask the students to think about whatever book we're studying and think of one word to characterize the book. All of the things, focus into one word. And so for Genesis, often it's like beginnings or creation. Joshua, it's often the land, because they're settling in and taking the land. The word that comes up often in Judges, at least in my mind, is chaos. I don't know is everybody supposed to have read Judges before we start, or? Okay. When I teach, I say you have to read the whole book before we start, and you got to read it in one sitting. You can't do it, so you got to find 2 or 3 hours, whatever. But when I read Judges like that, another word that's on the outline that I gave you, if you have the outline, just take a look. It's a front and back or 2-page outline of the Book of Judges. What do you notice about that outline? Besides that it's really great. Apostasy, right? So for years I was thinking of chaos as the key word for Judges, and certainly that's a good word for it. But apostasy, I think, captures a more spiritual slant on it and the biblical authors and writers' perspective on the book. But anyway, when I read through the Book of Judges, I feel like I need to take a shower, wash my hands. So you're going to have a whole semester of sludge. But I love looking at this and looking at the positive slant and things that Sharice has put together. So again, looks really good. All right. I'm just going to give you some sort of the typical academic kinds of stuff about the book, and I'll talk you through the outline a little bit after I do this first stuff, and then I'll talk about the bibliography, and then there'll be some time for questions and answers. So, although, Pam, I'm thinking maybe no questions and answers today, because when I was here for Joshua, there were a lot of questions that I couldn't answer. A lot of questions that were too hard. So I'm just going to, no questions. Okay. All right. This is a milestone today. Lots of reasons, of course, but one of them, what you see up here is the very first PowerPoint that I ever created. I created it this week. I'm in my 43rd year of teaching, and I managed to make it out through all those years without ever creating a PowerPoint. I had the old overhead transparencies. I had the whiteboard. But literally, this is the first PowerPoint I've ever created. So I'm kind of proud of myself. Anyway. All right, see if I can get it going. All right, here we go. Author and title. So the book derives its title, of course, from the 12 leaders of Israel during the period that follows the book of Joshua. There's a dozen judges, about 6 of them what we sometimes call major judges, the others what we call minor judges. The book is anonymous. There's no claim in the book as to who wrote it. There's no claim outside the Bible as to who wrote it. So we really don't know. And that's a little bit unsettling for some people because we're used to thinking, well, an important part of understanding a book is knowing the author. And that's true, obviously, for the Pauline epistles or the Pentateuch with Moses, Psalms with David, others. But many of the Old Testament books, and in the New Testament, we have at least one, Hebrews, there are no authors indicated. And in my view, it's a waste of time to try to spend time figuring out who the author might have been. The rabbis did it, but if the Bible doesn't tell us this information, then we can guess if we want, but it's not that crucial. If it was really crucial, the Bible would have told us who was the writer. So, short answer, who is the author? I don't know. Now, there's a collection of blocks of materials. If you remember reading it maybe in the past, there's stories about the major judges and how they led in battle and so on. Deborah, of course, in chapters 4 and 5. Gideon, chapters 6 to 8. Jephthah, chapter 11. Samson, chapters 13 to 16. So who knows? Maybe these things were recorded over time, over the decades, and then somebody at the end of the time kind of put them all together. We do know that sometimes scripture books, like especially Kings and Chronicles, have relied on outside sources. Remember in Kings it says, "And the rest of the acts of such and such king, are they not written in the records of the books of the kings of Israel or Judah?" Whatever. We don't have those books, but they've been compiled. So it shouldn't be unsettling to us to think that maybe parts of the book of Judges were written along the way, and somebody at the end of the period kind of brought them together with the framework that we'll look at, with the outline, under the inspiration of the Spirit, of course, as they're all put together. Jewish tradition assigns the authorship to Samuel, who comes afterwards, of course. Plausible, but again, we don't really know. Oops. So, when did these things take place? Some good round numbers for you in terms of thinking of Old Testament history would be Abraham around 2000 BC, 2,000 years before Christ. Moses, Joshua about 1400, 1,400 years before Christ. The book of Joshua takes place over about 30 years, and then Judges begins after the death of Joshua. So maybe these are approximate, but maybe around 1350, the middle of the 1300s BC would be when the first things in Judges takes place, and all the way down to time of Samuel. Samuel was the final judge, the 13th judge. We don't read about him in the book of Judges, but this would be so it's about a 300-year period, maybe 350, somewhere in there. So that's the date of the events. The date of the composition, in other words, when was the book written? It would have had to have been written after the final events, of course, after 1050, 11th century sometime. If you want to take your Bibles and look, I'll show you a passage that kind of helps us with something. Turn to chapter 18, Judges 18. And this is part of the end of the book where there's all this really sordid stuff about murder and civil war and all kinds of apostasy. But I just want to look at the end. Look at verse 30, chapter 18. And it says, so Judges 18, verse 30, and the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribes of the Danites until, what? The day of captivity of the land. Now, does that ring a bell? Hundreds of years later. The captivity of the land was in the 500s BC. So about 800 years later. So I don't think the whole book was written way back at that time. But I think that maybe there was the Holy Spirit again inspired somebody to write this and say, well, until all this time, they were priests, so for centuries. And so a terminus ad quem, in other words, the final time of writing could have been as far late as that. Wouldn't have been any earlier than the 1100s. But again, we don't know. I'm guessing, turn to chapter 1. Show you something else. I'm guessing that most of the book was written by the time of David, who a good round number for David is about 1000 BC. So look at chapter 1, verse 21. It's talking about some of the tribes, some of the peoples that the Israelites were not able to dislodge from their land. Chapter 1, verse 21 says, the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem till this day. Well, if you may remember, in the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel, David leads an army to capture Jerusalem and drive out the Jebusites. So feels like this part of the book would have been a note saying they're still around and we haven't captured the Jebusites yet. So this would have, most of the book, is my guess, is before time of David. Ultimately, it's not that terribly important, but that's the idea. All right, here's what I would write as the theme of the book. Another exercise that I have for my students to do is every time they read a book of the Bible, they have to summarize the book, not just in one word, but in one sentence. And all the strands of the book should be captured in some way, directly or indirectly, in that sentence. So this is mine, and you can like it or not. I don't really care. It's mine. So what do I think the theme of the book is? I think it's the downward spiral of Israel's national and spiritual life into chaos and apostasy. So there's my two words. Showing the need for a godly king to lead it. So you remember there's a kind of a cycle in the book. People turned away from the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hands of whatever enemy. The enemy oppressed them. The people cried out. God raised up the next judge to deliver them. They were delivered. Then the land had rest for 40 years or 80 years. And then the cycle begins again. And you have that, again, we'll look at the framework, chapters 1 and 2, a little later this morning. But I would say that the cycle is not just a kind of recurring cycle like this, history repeating itself. It's more a cycle like this, going downhill. And the farther we get into the book, the worse things seem to be getting. Okay, so my statement of theme, it's the downward spiral. It's a spiral, it's a repeated history going downward of Israel's national and spiritual life. The national life is they're under the thumb of whatever oppressors. And the spiritual life is they're turning away to all the different gods, etc. And it results in chaos. And, especially at the end of the book, there's these terrible stories about man hiring his own Levite to be his own private priest, and a concubine, and then she gets killed and chopped up into 12 parts and sent around, and there's a civil war, and so that's just a trigger alert. If you want to miss like the last month so you don't get all that, Charisse will excuse you, I'm sure. But it just gets worse and worse. But the point of the book is not to say, look how bad things have been, and that's it. But rather, at the end, we'll look at this again later this morning, looking ahead to the need for a godly king. And in the history, the godly king ultimately was David. But David, of course, from the larger perspective of the New Testament, David is a symbol and a type of who Christ, it was all pointing to. So there's a forward-looking nature to the book that's a little more hopeful than that chaos and apostasy perspective. All right. What's the purpose of the book? Really, similar to what we just said. It was written to show the consequences of religious apostasy over and over again. How Israel sinned and how that led to consequences. So it's written to show the consequences of religious apostasy and to point the way to a king who, if he was righteous, he would lead the people to God. Again, my view is that God intended from the very beginning that Israel ultimately would have a godly king, a man like God, after God's own heart. The book of Judges is an important part of that piece of that puzzle. Now I grew up in a Christian home. My parents are missionaries in Latin America. And I had godly teachers, godly parents. And one of the things I learned was that when Israel asked for a king in the book of Samuel, this was against God's will. And God's will was that Israel should never have a king. It would always be their own relationship directly with God, and that they should never have a king. My view is no. God intended from the very beginning that they should have a king, but it needed to be a godly king of a certain type, and not like the gods of the nation, or not like the kings of the nations. And so, as you read through the book, and especially at the end, talking about there's no king in Israel, everybody do right in their own eyes. The flip side of that is, if there had been a king, a godly king, everybody would do right in the Lord's eyes. They would be doing well. So, now think of the book of Joshua. Remember, Genesis through Deuteronomy. At the end of Genesis, God's people are in exile in Egypt and looking to get back to the promised land. In Exodus, they're down at Mount Sinai, but they're still not there. Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they're still looking ahead. Book of Joshua is the one in which it's looking back and say, sort of the idea of, we're finally here. We got the land. We can have rest. And so there's a settledness in many ways to the book of Joshua. But even there are some little hints, if you remember reading in Joshua, that there's about half a dozen, 6 or 8 little references to the tribe of such and such could not drive out whatever peoples from their territory. And that's kind of a subtle, like a ticking time bomb that's going to explode in the book of Judges. So everything is not all sweetness and light at the end of Joshua. But it explodes now in the chaos and apostasy in Judges. All right, what's the occasion? The occasion of the book rose out of the apostate conditions of the time. It was written as a justification for the monarchy. So, whether it's written after the establishment of the Davidic monarchy or looking ahead to it, doesn't really matter. The text of the book is looking ahead. It doesn't mention David or Samuel, but it's looking ahead to the time when there would be a godly king in place. Uh, maybe this is a good place to do a little quick. Okay, everybody shut their phones off. That was my brother calling to give me grief. So, I didn't prepare an overhead for this part of the power. Remember, this is my first PowerPoint. Next time I do this, I'll have this next part in the PowerPoint, but I don't. So I'm going to use the whiteboard. Can all of you see this? Okay. Okay, these are some references you can write down, but I'd like some volunteers to look each one up and read it aloud for us. So, number one, who will look that one up? All right, thank you. And number two, if you don't mind. And the third one, thank you. That's all we're going to do. Everybody else, if you want to turn to the final one, 49:10, we can do that. But what these passages are is telling us, or showing us how what I would argue is that God's plan for his people from the very beginning was that they should have a king. All right? So, the first one, God is speaking to Abraham, Genesis chapter 17, verse 6. And if you have that and read it loudly, please. No. I'm sorry. Read it really loud.
I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you.
All right? So God is speaking to Abraham, giving him part of the promises. There's a whole list of promises. In class, when I do the Abrahamic covenant, we fill up the board maybe with 15 or 20 things that God promised to give to Abraham or to do for him. One of them, could you read it again, please?
I'm already on to the next.
Oh, dear. 17, verse 6.
I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you.
Promise of kings, along with fruitfulness, nations, and other parts, the land, riches, old age, etc. Second one, God is speaking to Abraham about Sarah. And yes?
I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her.
Okay. Third one, God is speaking to Jacob. And read that one.
And God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body.
So all three of them mention several things, but what we're focusing on is the idea of kings. Now, my question, let's say my students come up with 20 things that God is going to give to the people or promise to them. Do you think it's 19 blessings and one curse thrown in there? I'm going to give you all these wonderful things, but I'm going to give you kings. I see some no's. That's the right answer. So, no, it's part and parcel of the blessings. Kings from the line of David, or from the line of Abraham. That's a good thing. All right, let's all turn to Genesis 49. And this passage is at the end of the book, obviously, but it's Jacob having come down to Egypt. Joseph has been there, and saved the nation from the famine, and his brothers are reconciled and so on. Jacob gathers his sons around him at the end of his life. And if you see in your Bibles, it looks like a poem. It's written in poetic form. And it's a blessing on all the 12 sons. And so you could go through and do a study every week on different ones of the blessings on the sons. But I'm going to jump into the one about Judah and look at Genesis 49, verse 8. Jacob says to Judah, his fourth son, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. Most of you have read the book of Genesis. Doesn't this echo something that's, well, actually, some of you sat through a preaching series recently. Book of Genesis, right? Okay. So what does this remind you of earlier? Joseph's dreams, right? Because in the dreams, people, they were bowing down to him. Now it's switching. Jacob is saying that brothers are going to bow down to you, Judah. So it's a switch. Jump to verse 10. The scepter. What's a scepter? So symbol of authority, king's staff, whatever it is. The scepter will not depart from Judah. So it seems like it's implicit that it's going to be resident in Judah. It's going to belong, the symbol of authority is going to be in Judah. Nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until, in ESV says, until tribute comes to him. Some different Bible readings, King James and some versions say until Shiloh comes, which is not very intelligible. In NIV and some others say until he comes to whom it belongs. I think that's probably the best reading. But regardless, the whole point of this verse is that royal authority is being vested in Judah. Okay? Till tribute comes to him, till he comes to whom it belongs, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So all of a sudden Judah is being raised up. So we have these verses at the beginning, the three of them saying to Abraham and descendants, kings are going to come from your line. And those are kind of an undifferentiated promise. It's just kind of general. But now here at the end of Genesis, it's saying, it's going to be from the line of Judah. And of course, fast forward, we ultimately know David came from the line of Judah, Jesus did, so on. But all that to say is, again, I would argue the idea of a king is part of God's plan from the very beginning. So let's look quickly at a passage in Deuteronomy that helps us to focus on the kind of king that God wanted. So turn to Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17. So you remember, I hope you remember that Deuteronomy is a series of sermons, essentially, that Moses delivered at the end of his career, end of his ministry, 40 years. And he's not going to be going into the promised land. So he's kind of looking back over the last 40 years and say, here's what God's done for us, and here's what I hope and pray for you in the future. He repeats the laws, many of them, because the people he's talking to are the second generation that weren't born yet when they came out of Egypt or were underage. And so there's a lot of repetition of old laws, but also some new ones looking ahead. And so, chapter 17, starting in verse 14, there's a law, in my heading in the Bible says, laws concerning Israel's kings. Another Bible I had called it the Charter for Kingship. It's kind of like the foundational document for what kind of king they should have. So, Deuteronomy 17, verse 14. When you come, remember they're not in the land yet. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it, and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are round about me. So think of the time frame. Here's Moses. They're not in the land yet under Joshua, let alone hundreds of years later under Samuel. But Moses is saying, the time's going to come when you get into that land, And you're going to look around and say, we'd like a king. So this is anticipating, the book of Samuel. And it's really interesting to see what God's response is. If I was going to think of the answer, if I were to guess what God would have been saying here, according to my Sunday school teachers, I would have thought, God just said, absolutely not, no king. But the next verse says, you may indeed set a king over you. The Hebrew construction there is an especially emphatic construction. So it's not just say, yeah, sure, go ahead. It's like, definitely go ahead and do it. You've got permission. So again, that sort of is rooted in these texts here. That's part of God's plan. God says, yep, go ahead, do it. But there's a series of 6 conditions in the next verses. So the kind of king that God wants is carefully outlined and circumscribed by the rest of this text. So let's look at verse 15. You may indeed set a king over you, number 1, whom the Lord your God will choose. Can't be just anybody. God has to choose the king. Now, when you get to the book of Judges, remember in chapter 9, one of the sons of Gideon, Abimelech, sets himself up as king. And he reigns as king for 3 years. So technically, if a pop quiz on who was the first king in Israel, one answer might be, well, that actually Abimelech. But the answer is no, because the Bible, God didn't choose him, and the Bible never treats him as a real king. So it has to be somebody God chose. So Saul, the first king, God did choose him in spite of his flaws, and David, etc. Number 1, has to be a king God chooses. Number 2, one from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. So the king has to be an Israelite. Number 3, only must not acquire many horses for himself. Okay? Not acquire many horses. What's the deal behind that? It's not like God didn't like horse race gambling. What's the point of too many horses? Well, not quite. The wealth is coming up. Horses will be with the chariots. Horses they pull the chariots. They are heart of the military. The horses are the ancient equivalent of tanks. So let me show you something here. Okay. What do you see? Pregnant horse.
Strong-willed woman.
This is the Pharaoh. This is an actual rendition of several different things that have survived that were put on the side of temples or different places in Egypt. And again, this is my first PowerPoint. I didn't have time to put those pictures in, so I got my own. This is my rendering of it. Maybe not so good, but of course. And here's another part of the picture. there's half a dozen figures lying on the floor, on the ground, under the horse's hoofs, and these are the king's enemies. So what is this Egyptian rendering communicate? Power. The Pharaoh is the mighty warrior. He crushes his enemies. There's no equal, etc. So this is the model found in several pictures in Egypt, also from Assyria and Babylon. You see the kings leading the people in battle. This is the image, both in pictures and also texts. A lot of the archaeological discoveries in the Nineveh and Egypt and Canaan and so on have texts that talk about the exploits of the kings. So the prevailing vision and view of kings in the ancient world, of course, today too in many countries, the most powerful dictator is the one that rules the country. But the mightiest warrior was going to be the one to be the king. Or, flip side, the king is the mightiest warrior. So when God says here, the Israelite king is not to multiply horses, what's he telling them? What's the message? His model for the Israelite king is a profoundly countercultural model. The Israelite king is not to aspire to that. And so when they said, give us a king like the nations, I think the request is not the fact, give us a king because all the other nations have a king. God said you can have a king. I think what's behind their request is give us a king like the nations. In other words, give us a king like that. Give us a king who will lead us in fighting battles. And the sin behind that, of course, is what? Their history so far, Exodus, Joshua, all the battles, victory comes from the Lord. But they're wanting a human-centered king. And that's, in a sense, dethroning God as their warrior. So anyway, back to the text here. 3 criteria so far. 1, a king that the Lord chooses. Number 2, an Israelite. Number 3, not a warrior like this. Number 4, continuing in verse 16, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. What's behind that one? I think the idea is don't seek foreign alliances to help you. Don't go back to Egypt and say, help us, give us more horses. Fast forward several hundred years. Remember in the book of Jeremiah, when Jeremiah is preaching, is saying, your sins are upon you and the Lord is going to punish you. He's going to bring the Babylonians to take you captive to Babylon. That's the punishment, but don't worry, he's going to bring you back after 70 years. And one of the things he said was, don't look to Egypt to help against the Babylonians. So the great irony is, there was this debate within Jerusalem that some wanted to enlist the Egyptians against the Babylonians, some didn't. Jeremiah was saying don't. And the great irony is he was kidnapped by the party that wanted to go to Egypt. He was taken to Egypt, and that's where he died. So that's an illustration in history playing out of this text. So the fourth criterion is don't look to foreign alliances. Again, the subtext behind that is look to the Lord. All right, the fifth criterion, verse 16, he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. So clearly the message here is many wives, probably large number of them foreign women who are bringing with them beliefs in other gods. Don't do that. Sixth criterion, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. that also will turn your heart away. Okay, so I see some wheels turning in some people's minds. I always kind of get a holographic image of somebody later when I read this. Can you read my mind? Solomon, right? Solomon had thousands of horses, hundreds of wives, great riches. Solomon is the perfect antitype of the godly king that God wanted in Israel. Now, obviously, Solomon did many good things. He wrote Proverbs and so on, but he was ultimately the time came when his wives turned his heart away from the Lord. The kingdom split because of him, so on. So this is the sort of the charter for kingship. God says, yes, you can have a king, but it needs to be a profoundly countercultural king. And let's see what happens. Okay. This is a session about judges, right? But I want to go to Samuel right now. Can we do that? All right, Samuel, please. 1 Samuel 8. So this is the chapter, many of you know it, where Israel finally asks for a king. And, Samuel is displeased. So let's look at it. 1 Samuel 8. So it says, when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. Now there should be little whistles and bells going off in your mind already. Because there's two problems here, at least. What are the problems? Okay, the book of Judges, whenever there was a judge, God raised up the next judge. Nobody took it upon himself to appoint the judge. So here, Samuel is doing something that he shouldn't have done, number one. Number two, what? He's establishing a dynastic succession. He's appointing his own sons as judges. In the book of Judges, none of the judges is the son of the previous judge. So Samuel is arrogating to himself power and authority that he shouldn't. So it shouldn't surprise us that things begin to unravel. Verse 2 tells us the names of the sons. Verse 3 says they did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. So things are bad. It's just continuing the downward cycle of the book of Judges. So the response, verse 4, the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel and said to him, look, you're old. Your sons don't walk in your ways. Now appoint for a king to judge us. Some of your versions say to govern us or to rule us, but ESV says to judge us, and that's what the Hebrew says. Remember, book of Judges, when God raised up the next judge, what was the primary reason to raise up that judge? It was to deliver them, to meet the next military crisis. And they defeated, whoever. So they're asking, verse 5, appoint for us a king to do the same thing that the judges were doing, and to do so like the supreme leaders among the nations. So again, it's just following the wrong path. So Samuel's unhappy, displeased, verse 6, and he prays to the Lord. Verse 7, God says, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, because they have not rejected you, they have rejected me from being king over them. Why have they rejected God from being king, or how have they done that? They're deposing him as their military deliverer, as their guarantee, salvation, and wanting to elevate the human king. So, Samuel then in verses 11 through 18 warns him about some of the burdens that a king is going to bring. But look at verse 19. The people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. They said, nope, there shall be a king over us. Verse 20. that we may also be like all the nations. We already knew that from verse 5. Secondly, verse 20, that our king may judge us again. Well, we already knew that from verse 5 as well. But now, the last part of verse 20 gives us real insight into their motivation. What do they want this king to do? Go out before us and fight our battles. That's what they're asking. They're asking for a king like this. And so it should be no surprise that that Samuel's angry, that God says they're deposing me, and so on. Now, can't prove it, but think of the model of the ideal king in Deuteronomy 17. Oh, I'm sorry. Go back to Deuteronomy 17. You see, I don't have this on the PowerPoint, so I skipped it. Deuteronomy 17. So all these things that the kings were not to do or to be, the 6 criteria, verses 15 to 17. What is the king to do? What kind of king are they to have? And that's in Deuteronomy 17, verses 18 to 20. So let's look at that. So when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. Think of, book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The king writing a copy of all that, it's going to take a lot of time. And when you copy something, you absorb it better than just reading it. So the king is to internalize God's word. Verse 19, it shall be with him. He shall read it all the days of his life. For what purpose? That they may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them. Verse 20, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers. So not this kind of, superior military, great conquering hero. May not turn aside from the commandment either to right or the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. Okay. Don't need to turn back to Samuel, but I think if the people had come to Samuel and said, give us a king to lead us in study of God's word, I think Samuel would have said, great, good idea. Let me check with the Lord. So the whole point in this whole kingship study, there's a great theology of kingship, I would say, from the beginning to the end of the Bible. The whole point of that is that God intended for there to be godly kings in the land. Israel asked for the wrong kind of king. That was the problem. Now, it's the book of Judges is in between. It's before the request for kingship in Samuel. But that all of this kind of puts the context into the request at the end, or the statement at the end, there's no king in Israel. Everybody did right in their own eyes. That's the author's final commentary on. Actually, let's do that. Let me ask for some more volunteers. Anybody want me to sign this? No? Okay. I'm crushed. So here's four passages toward the end of Book of Judges. And again, if I could have 4 volunteers to look at them. So who would look up 17:6 for us? Thank you. Next one, 18:1, 19:1, last one, going once, going, okay, thank you. All right. So give you a second here, but have you read them, and then we'll make a couple comments. All right, 17:6.
In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw.
Okay. Read again, please.
In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit.
Okay. That's a modern, more smooth translation. Older versions, ESV says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everybody did right in their own eyes. Okay. 18:1.
In those days, there was no king in Israel.
Thank you. Again.
In those days, there was no king.
Thank you. 19:1. Who has 19:1? I thought there was a volunteer for that.
In those days, when there was no king in Israel.
Thank you. And 21:25.
In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own.
All right. And now read the next verse 26. What's that? Well, I'm just asking. Read verse 26.
There isn't one.
Really?
Not here. Let me go through it.
No, that's the last comment in the book, right? I'm remembering now. I gotcha.
Everyone did what
No, no,
was right in his own eyes.
Okay. And the whole point is these are toward the end of the book, the final, what I would call editorial comments by the author of the book, commenting on the events of the book. So this downward cycle, he's telling all the stories, but the author also says, now here's my comments about all that. This is happening because there's no king in Israel, the result being everybody's doing whatever they want. I think the author of Judges has Deuteronomy 17 in his mind, saying the flip side would be if there had been a godly king after the model of Deuteronomy 17, everybody's eyes would turn to the Lord. They would have done right in the Lord's eyes. So that, to me, again, the purpose of the book is to show the downward slide of apostasy, but also to look ahead to a godly king. In other words, it seems to me the author of Judges is waving a little flag, whistles and bells, saying, we need a king. Because right now there's no king, there's chaos, there's apostasy. A godly king is going to direct our focus on the Lord. Now, of course, obviously, as you know, sadly, in the centuries following, there were more ungodly kings than godly kings. And there was a continued downward cycle. Ups and downs. There was, remember, in kingdom divided. Saul was a ungodly king ultimately. David was a godly king. Solomon was mixed. After that, the kingdom split. In the north, there were 20 kings. None of them were good. In the south, in Judah, there were also 20 kings. Eight were good. A dozen were evil. So the ideal was not lived out very well. But that doesn't undermine the validity of the ideal. What God wanted was a king like the Deuteronomy 17 model, and that's what I would argue is behind essentially the whole book of Judges. Telling the story, yes, but for the purpose of saying, it's so bad now, let's look ahead to something better. All right. I'm not going to draw any more pictures. I'm getting tired of the abuse. All right. It's not a very good map. It's hard to see. But talk a little bit about the historical background to the book. And this is a map from the ESV Study Bible. So if you have a ESV Study Bible, that should be there. Or if not, it's on the website. But anyway, how am I doing with the sound if I move away a little bit? So this is the land occupied by the Israelites during the settlement period, the green. So this is at the end of Joshua, beginning of Judges. Notice that all the land they occupied in the Promised Land itself was in what we would call the Central Highlands. They didn't occupy the coastland. The Philistines are powerful along here. Other Canaanites up here. So they had pockets here. The 2.5 tribes that settled east of the Jordan were living across here. Reuben, Gad, half tribe of Manasseh. So this is the extent pretty much of the conquest in the book of Joshua. We have this idea that they conquered everything. Well, everything in air quotes. It's essentially this. Here's another way of looking at it. This is talking about each judge, where they came from. And here's another map that shows it in a different way. But let's look at here. So for Shamgar in chapter 3, Elon, Barak, Gideon, Yair, Tola, all these guys. Here's Samson from down here. Deborah's from over here. Othniel, Jephthah. So what this should show you is that the judges were all scattered through the land. When God raised up whatever judge, it was from a different section of the land. And I don't know if you thought of this, but probably each of the judges and the stories behind their exploits were not encompassing the entire land. Each of the stories seems to take place in a certain regional area, maybe in the north, maybe in the south, in separate areas. So God raised up different judges in different pockets wherever there was oppression, and maybe everyone was not, a universal struggle or battle. The other thing to maybe show you, and again, since I just did a PowerPoint, I forgot to do this. But if I were to show you the chronology, if you add, it says so-and-so was judges so many years, and the land had rest for 40 years, 80 years, whatever. If you add up those years, and we know the dates of David. All right, David became king, this is a precise number, in 1010 BC. I gave you a round number for David is 1000 BC. It's actually 1010 BC. We know the end of Moses' life around 1400, around 1400. A precise number would be 1406 BC. So from 1406 to 1010 is 400 years. But if you add up the chronology of the book of Joshua, then all the judges, then the reign of Saul, the add them up, it's much more than 400 years. It's about 550 something. So it doesn't fit the known dates that we know from other sources. So the thinking is that I'll show you on the board. The thinking is that whatever judge had his or her own ministry, it might have overlapped with somebody else in a different part of the land. So that it's compressed a bit, that would fit into that 300, maybe 350 year period. So when you're looking at the map here again, different parts of the land, here it shows the tribes more visibly, Eastern Manasseh, Gad, Reuben, all these tribes. And then it shows where the judges are from. Kind of reinforces what I just said. So what about the historical background behind all of this? Couple things to know. If you think of the dates of the book, of the events of the book, 1350 to about 1050. Notice this date, something called the Late Bronze Age, is from 1550 to 1200. So if the book of Judges begins in around 1350, it's beginning in the last 150 years of an era that we know as the Late Bronze Age. Now, the Late Bronze Age in the ancient Near East, this is a terrible map. It's a great map, but it's just hard to see everything. But here's, the land of Israel, Judah. Here's Canaan. There's the great empires. It's not shown here, but here's Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. Here's Babylon, the capital of the Babylonian Empire. Here's the Persian Empire. Here's the Hittites up here. Here's Egypt. And all through the known world in the Late Bronze Age, including in Canaan, archaeological excavations have shown in the last 150 years that it was a time of great prosperity, great international trade and communication, great cities, great libraries that have been excavated. The tablets discovered show trade between things in Canaan itself. There was a level of prosperity visible. There were wealthy houses, big public buildings, a lot of personal wealth like carved ivories, like precious stones, things like that. And there were great walled cities. And so toward the end of the Late Bronze Age, everything is really, really good. Remember, that's when Moses sent the spies in to the land. What did they see? Saw great walled cities. They saw great giants. We felt like grasshoppers to them, and so on. So they're seeing all this prosperity, all this things are going well at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Spiritually, though, there was great apostasy, great worship of other gods, etc. But anyway, the period of the Judges begins in the middle of the Late Bronze Age against the backdrop of great international wealth. But it moves on into what we call the early Iron Age, and 1200 is an approximate number, but after 1200, the archaeological excavations across the map show a great turmoil, great levels of destruction, and after that, great levels of poverty. The cities are abandoned. There are villages, populations like scattered out, so it's almost like the aftermath of a nuclear war. Things just get flattened and little settlements begin out wherever, but the cities are not rebuilt. And for about 200 years, everything is really dark. And for the next 150 years, from 1200 down to 1050, second part of the book of Judges. So if we see the chaos in the book of Judges, in the actual the Bible, behind that, archaeologically, we can see there's chaos all around, and especially that great upheaval at around 1200 that changed the landscape. So that's kind of the historical background. There were big empires. There were big empires in the Late Bronze Age. All the big empires kind of retreated into themselves, and there was just local stuff for the early Iron Age until about 1000 BC. All right, let's talk about the Canaanites and their religion, because that's the backdrop of the book of Judges. When I was a kid, I learned all these Bible stories. I read through the Bible. My parents gave me a little New Testament when I was 6. I began reading it. Gave me a Bible in 2nd grade, and I'd read the whole thing by the time I was in 4th grade. Not that I was really reading it for content. My mom gave me a little chart that had X's on it, and every time you read a chapter, you fill an X. So I was reading it to fill the X's. And I finished, but I knew the stories. And I was a good little Pharisee. Because I would say, there's no way I would have ever been like those people. I would have been the godly type. I would not have been a hypocrite like in the book of Judges or New Testament. I would not have been like the Pharisees. I would have been like the godly, whatever. So as an adult, I've looked back and said, well, my goodness, if I as a kid could discern how terrible it was to turn away to all those other gods, why? Why did they continue to do that? What was the payoff? What was the allure? Because obviously they did. They kept going after that. And I think one of the allures is the allure of materialism. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Famous passage at the beginning, the Lord your God is one Lord. Teach your children as they walk by the way, etc., etc. But I want to start in verse 10. Deuteronomy 6, verse 10. It's looking ahead. They're not in the land of Canaan yet. And it says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to give to you. And now notice what the description of the land. It's got great and good cities that you did not build. Houses full of all good things you did not fill. Cisterns you did not dig. Vineyards and olive trees you didn't plant. So think about Israel, coming out of Egypt. They've been slaves for 400 years. There's a new Pharaoh rose in Egypt that did not remember Joseph. They're under the thumb of the Egyptians. They're beaten down people with very low morale. There's no real sense of national identity. Remember when Moses is called, he says to God, who shall I tell him I am, or who's sent me? They're not going to follow me. So they're coming out of the wilderness, out of Egypt into the wilderness. Remember, they can't even survive in the wilderness. They can't find water. They can't find food. They're a sorry lot. So they send the spies in, and they see these great cities. They're impressed. The fruitfulness of the land flowing with milk and honey. You got bunches of grapes that 2 people had to carry. All this stuff here, God says, great cities you didn't build, houses full of gold, etc., etc. Excuse me. I think the Israelites could not have failed to be impressed by what's in Canaan. So we have here at the North Church, we had for a while at least, Tuesday night or Wednesday night, witnessing night in the neighborhood. So imagine the Israelites going out on Tuesday night witnessing night to the Canaanites, saying, you should follow our God. And the Canaanites going to respond, you're kidding. Look what you have. You have nothing. Look what we have. All these stuff. Who's given us this? Baal. Our God, Baal, has given all these things. So there might have been materialistic envy that led the Israelites away from God to Baal, who gave all these things. Another allure, I think, was sex. A couple of reasons. Canaanite religion, more so than Egyptian or Babylonian others, but Canaanite religion was very highly sexualized. Archaeological excavations have recovered images, little iron images of Baal, about this high, little terracotta pottery kind of images of Asherah, his wife, or his mother, depending on what text you read. And she's very highly sexualized. Big breasts, big sexual features. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy 23. Here's a passage again, looking ahead, where God is warning the people through Moses. And there's some miscellaneous laws here. Deuteronomy 23, verse 15. There's laws about a slave and a master. Look at Deuteronomy 23, verse 17. None of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute. Some versions translate that as temple prostitute or sacred prostitute. Let me keep reading. None of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute, and none of the sons of Israel shall be a cult prostitute. So we think our society is highly sexually perverted, and it is, but nothing new under the sun. Male and female prostitution. And there, I'll show you in a minute. Let me keep reading. Verse 18, you shall not bring the fee of a prostitute. Now there's some different words here. This word here is the normal word for prostitute, the kind that you find, sadly, in almost every culture. This is the word here is the same word for Rahab in Joshua 2. The first two are different words. They're cult, temple, sacred prostitutes. Anyway, you shall not bring the fee of a regular prostitute or the wages of a dog. And the ESV footnote says, possibly also male prostitute. Don't bring the fees of these prostitutes into the house of the Lord your God in payment for any vow. For both of those are an abomination to the Lord your God. So, this is the word for holy, kadosh. Can you say it? Kadosh. Okay. So now you know two Hebrew words. Shalom, kadosh. Actually, you know more. Amen. Hallelujah. At least four. Anyway, this is the central word. This is the one word I would use to describe Leviticus. The word kadosh occurs all kinds of times in Leviticus. But the word for female cult prostitute that we just read, kedeshah. And the one for male is kadesh. I hope you can see the consonants, the root consonants of each of these words are the same. So these words for the temple, cult, sacred prostitutes are related to the word for holiness in a terrible, bizarre perversion of this. But so who are these? Okay, just so you know, the regular word for prostitute is zonah. That's what Rahab was, and that's just the normal type. These, why were they called cult prostitutes or sacred prostitutes? Well, the reason is because in Canaan, there was a whole edifice, religious systems. There were sanctuaries, there were priests, there were priestesses of Baal and Asherah and the other gods and goddesses. Baal was the god of they imagined Baal was the god of the storm, the god of the clouds. The Canaanite texts call him the rider on the clouds, so he's kind of riding across the heavens in the clouds. But as the storm god, he's the one that sends the rain. And the rain waters the earth, makes crops grow. So Baal is also the god of fertility. Now, bracket for a minute, think of hundreds of years later. Remember, Elijah has this big confrontation with prophets of Baal. And what's happened in the 3 years before this confrontation? There's no rain. Who's the god of the rain? In the Canaanite mythology, it's Baal, and yet Baal has not been able to bring the rain. And what happens when this episode is finished? Elijah goes out and looks west, and what's he see? A little cloud, and the rain comes. So that episode, and there's several different levels to it, but one of them is it's kind of a heart, it's driving a stake into the heart of the Canaanite belief system, and Baal is the one that provides the rain. Anyway, back to this. So the idea was you'd bring your sacrifices, you'd bring your offerings of grain or animals to the sanctuary of Baal, and in hopes that Baal would then favor you and send the rain on your land. And while you're at it, there's priests and priestesses, male and female prostitutes that you could spend time with there. And in a physical, earthly way, you could simulate the act of fertility, hoping that they would persuade Baal to make, your land prosperous. So there was this highly sexualized component to Canaanite religion, and we see it here again in the Bible. Turn to Leviticus 18. Again, this is looking ahead, talking about things they're not to do. Start in verses 6 to 23. Leviticus 18, verses 6 to 23. There's a whole section that details the perversions, the debauchery of the Canaanites. And it's all related to different kind of sexual perversions. We won't read it, but there's incest, adultery, bestiality, even homosexuality, etc. And verse 24 says, now at the end of the list, says, do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things. For by all of these, the nations I'm driving out before you have become unclean. In other words, when you go into Canaan and you drive out these nations, they're the ones that have been practicing these things. So what's some of the allure? Back to the PowerPoint. Oh, one more. Numbers 25. You may remember the episodes of Balaam and Balak. Israel was coming out in the wilderness, and one of the kings there is threatened by them, and so he calls for a Mesopotamian soothsayer, prophet, called Balaam, and wants him to curse Israel. God twists him around, makes him bless Israel instead, and there's these great speeches where Balaam is offering great blessings, even almost against his will. But now look at when it's finished, when Balaam goes back home, at the end of chapter 25, verse 1. Numbers 25, verse 1. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore, or some versions say to play the prostitute or to prostitute themselves. The root behind that is the word zonah. They began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate, bowed down to their gods, etc. So notice the attraction. There's these women from Moab. They're seducing them, inviting them to come, eat, drink, be merry. Let's have a good time. So the sexualized nature of Canaanite religion, I think, would have been another draw for many Israelites. Again, you imagine Tuesday night, witnessing night, Canaan, knocking on doors. Come follow our God. Canaanites say, you're kidding. Look what we do in church. We go to the sanctuaries, bring our offerings, we have time with the prostitutes. Much more attractive than Israelites' religion for many. Third thing was what I would call peer pressure. As you know, I'm sure, pretty much every culture surrounding Israel worshipped dozens and dozens of gods and goddesses. There weren't just one. There was a highest level, maybe 2 or 3 or 4, the highest gods. Then there was the next level of dozens of gods and goddesses. The next level would have been gods and goddesses of places, like in Numbers 25, the Baal of Peor. And the 4th level would be gods and goddesses of the clans or families. So that would be like the gods that Rachel stole from Laban in Genesis. He runs after them to retrieve the household gods. In the book of Jonah, remember when the storm comes up, Jonah's in the ship, and all the sailors are afraid, so everybody calls on their own god. Maybe this god will answer, maybe that god will answer, etc. So everybody has their own gods and goddesses. Israel, just one. How cool is it? Did you have just one? The more the merrier, the better. So look at this picture. This is an inscription uncovered at a site in Sinai Desert, or the northern Sinai Desert, the Negev Desert, in a place called Kuntila Ajrud. And there was a little village. It was an Israelite village dating around 800 BC, which is in the middle of the kings, the times of the monarchies, a few decades after Ahab in the north. And they uncovered, the foundations of houses, and there was clearly a sanctuary or temple there. There was paintings on pottery and some bigger pieces of clay. And this one is just amazing. Because it shows 3 figures. Most scholars say these are 2 bulls. They're powerful. They're strong and sturdy. This is more of a female image, sitting like maybe a cow playing a harp. You could tell that, right? Be thankful I included this in my classes. Usually I just draw this and it's worse. This one has this little headdress on, and that's a headdress of a god named Bes, B-E-S, from Egypt. So think of the geography. I won't put it on the board, but Egypt is down here. Israel, Canaan is up here. Kuntila Ajrud is sort of in between. And so one of the gods they seem to be worshiping is one of the Egyptian gods. But this one is more powerful than this one. He's more prominent. And so scholars have, looked at it and tried to figure out. But notice up here, there's some writing. This is Hebrew writing, reading from right to left. And here's what it says. I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah. I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah. To me, that's just breathtaking. It's wrong in so many ways. One of them is just identifying Yahweh with a specific spot, Samaria. There's another text, or at least a couple other texts found in the same place to talk about Yahweh of Jerusalem. So they're seeing Yahweh as kind of localized deity in different places, which is not what the Bible teaches. But beyond that, scholars have wondered, well, now what in the world, what relationship is there between the inscription here and the drawings here? We know that the middle one is the god Bes from Egypt. That's where the term Old Bessie comes from. If you believe me, talk to me later about some swampland in Florida. But majority of scholars think that these are pictorial depictions of Yahweh and Asherah. Here's Yahweh. Here's his wife, Asherah. Yahweh is a strong bull, mighty, powerful. Asherah, wife. So, if you asked the people from Kuntilat Ajrud, do you worship Yahweh? What would the answer be? Yeah, of course. Look, we've got his picture here. And, you know, we kind of want to be seeker-friendly. So we're incorporating the Canaanite. He just gave him his wife, just like Baal has a wife. So we can reach out to the neighbors better. So to me, this is breathtaking because it's obviously a first-hand example, first-hand glimpse into the kind of apostasy that the prophets railed against. We see that secondhand through the words of the prophets, but we see it firsthand here of people that actually practiced this kind of belief, etc. So I think that when I was a kid, the perfect little Pharisee, saying I wasn't going to be like any of these people, I failed to account for these influences, the powerful allure of materialism, sex, peer pressure. The good news for us is that this happened more than 3,000 years ago. And we don't have these pressures anymore today. So we're good. Actually, isn't it amazing how even though culture changes, technology changes, human nature doesn't? We still have all these same things. All right, we need to move along. So I have the 5 key themes. I'm just going to go through quickly. They're on your handout. So Israel's existence in the Promised Land was threatened by the continuing apostasy. We've talked about that a lot. Number 2, the oppressions, chaos, generally negative picture in the book are due to Israel's repeated sin. Talk about that. God's faithfulness was the counterpoint to Israel's apostasy. He repeatedly delivered his people, so on. Number 4, the judges did little to arrest the downward cycle of apostasy. If anything, they fueled it. We haven't had time to talk about that, but you know, we think of the judges maybe as try to think of them as heroes, but I think most of them, they undermined things. Don't get into that. You can look at that as you move along. But people like Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, all of them were guilty of significant sin. And God worked through them, but more likely in spite of them. And they were part of the downward cycle for the most part. And 5, Israel needed a godly king to lead it, doing right in the Lord's eyes. We've already talked about that. So, I want to give time for questions, but let me just quickly talk about the bibliography that you should have. Well, okay. Yeah, we'll do the bibliography. So, if I could have my assistant. So I have this bibliography that's of things you might want to be aware of. One thing I'll say is I retired from teaching at Bethel Seminary after almost 30 years. And when I did, I didn't think I was going to be teaching anymore. So I donated or sold about 1,000 books. And then Dr. Brian Tabb came calling. Terrible. Because now I'm teaching and I'm thinking, oh, I wish I had that book. I wish I had, So I used to have all these books. I don't anymore. I have a few. But let me just go through. There are some that are more technical, and there are some that are more popular level. And we don't really have a church library like some churches do, but some churches would have them. You could go check them out. Anyway, some of the more technical ones are the first one by Daniel Block. Jan is sitting in the back and wants to hold them up. Big blue one. So wave it around to show how thick it is. So if you really want to get in depth, that's a really good one to know. Dan was a colleague of mine at Bethel back in the 80s, a good man. The next one is by Robert Chisholm, who teaches at Dallas Seminary. Similar kind of a book, thick book. I don't have it there. That's not Robert Chisholm. The next one is by Arthur Kundal, who was an older one. In a little series, this next series is a really good lay-level series. It's called the Tyndale Old Testament Commentary Series. You can find it on Google, Christian Books. It's a great series to have. They're small paperbacks, and you can buy the whole set for a fairly good price. Anyway, the one by Arthur Kundal on Judges is a small one, about 3/4 inch thick and small, so it's much more accessible. Dale Ralph Davis has another one, a lay-focused one, Judges of Great Salvation. I don't have that one back there. Mary Evans, Judges and Ruth, a commentary. That's the replacement for Kundal. The Tyndale Old Testament Commentary series have been revised in the last couple decades. The next one is the best one. Jen, want to hold up my historical book, my Moody book? I wrote this book called Introduction to the Old Testament Historical Books. There's a chapter in every book from Joshua to Esther. So there's a Judges chapter there. And then as Charisse or Pam mentioned, I also wrote the study notes for the book of Judges in the ESV Study Bible. So if you have that, the notes at the bottom of the page, at the beginning, they're all mine. If you found errors in what I wrote, don't tell me. C.F. Kyle, this is an old standard classic from the 19th century, two German scholars, but evangelical. It's called the Kyle Delitzsch Commentary on the Old Testament. Kyle's thing on the Book of Judges. You can get that series in 10 volumes from the entire Old Testament. It's really good. It's not very easily accessible today, but you can still get it on Amazon if you're really interested. Tim Keller wrote one in a whole series of things that he was writing, the book God's Word for You series, one in every book of the Bible, and had Judges for You. That's a good lay level, very accessible one. Miles Van Pelt wrote the Judges in a new commentary called the ESV Expository Commentary Series. That's the big black one, Jan. Want to look at that one? What Jen is holding is from what? Judges or Joshua through, or Deuteronomy through Ruth. So the Judges part is only a section of that big book there. Barry Webb wrote one in the New International Commentary Series. That's a big, heavy, in-depth one, sort of like the first one of Daniel Block. Very scholarly, but again, excellent. And then Lawson Younger wrote Judges and Ruth in something called the NIV Application Commentary. That's aimed at pastors, and that's a really good series to know about as well. So those are just some introductory things. At the bottom, there's some dictionaries of the Old Testament that have articles on Judges. So I think that's enough. I think what I need to do now is just see if there's any comments or questions. remember, only easy questions. Obviously, there's lots more we could talk about the specifics in the book. You're going to get into that with the study over the next few months. But still, anything you'd like to ask about? Okay, you're going to have to sit here until somebody asks a question. Yes? I can't hear you.
So these are your notes here?
If you have the ESES Study Bible, the notes at the beginning and the notes at the bottom of the page are mine. For the whole book of Judges. Yeah. I keep telling my daughters that I'm famous. I wrote things like that. I wrote books. They say, "No, Dad, you're not famous. Britney Spears is famous. Taylor Swift is famous. Not you." All right, yes. No, Sharice has all the answers. I'd be happy to come back if the occasion allowed. Yes?
I know I just keep asking if we'll meet certain biblical characters in heaven. Are there any of the judges that you think did not actually
Make it to heaven? Short answer is I have no idea. Oh, yeah. Are there any, her daughter asks, are there any of these judges we're actually going to meet in heaven? Or are there some that we're not going to meet there? It's hard, it's hard to know. The book of Judges is an author's choices of stories to tell, but they don't tell complete stories. So maybe, for example, Samson, I think he was a terrible character. God used his strength, obviously, to deliver them physically for the Philistines, but terrible morally, personally. Will he be in heaven? I don't know. Maybe in his dying actions, he was trusting in God to help him and to bring that temple down. Deborah, I think, would have certainly been there. Short answer, I have no idea. Okay, something else? Yeah, this is a hard question. Yeah. Easy questions. Yes?
I don't know if mine's easy, but so it sounded like the early Iron Age was a time of local government and not empire, so like the structure of the government was really similar
Right.
to Israel's structure. Would you say that there was any distinction in like what the nations around them were doing and what Israel was doing, or would you say no, they're pretty much doing all the same thing?
Good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. During the early Iron Age, when everything is kind of falling apart, everything is localized, decentralized. There's not the big power centers of the cities, etc. So what was happening in Israel, was it the same as what's happening in all these other places, or was there some differences? I think it's pretty much the same. Israelites were worshiping these other gods and goddesses. Every once in a while, there was this renaissance of a judge that delivered them, and they had some peace for a while. So maybe there's ups and downs, but there's these downward cycles, and it's pretty hard to distinguish between an Israelite site and a Canaanite site. Sometimes in digging down archaeologically, you get to you'll see pig bones and images of Baal, et cetera, and then the next level, or the next level above it, in other words, more recent, there'll be none of that. So maybe that's the Israelites for a while, where they were following some of the laws, but then there's more perversion, more contamination. So mostly the same, I would say. All right? Somebody else? Yes? What motivated me or intrigued me about this book? To be honest, not a whole lot. You kind of feel like you need to take a shower after the book. In my career over the years, I've mostly specialized in the book of Psalms and the book of Joshua. But I did get the invitation to write a book on all the historical books, so I had to write a chapter on Joshua. I've taught Joshua in class over the years because of that. So it's mostly been opportunity when I've been asked to do things. That's been the thing. The more serious answer is it does fit into this larger theme of kingship that I was talking about. And I think the book of Judges powerfully points ahead to the need for a godly king. If I were to write a textbook on biblical theology, which I'm not going to do, but if you ask me what in one word, what's the Bible about? Well, one word would be God. But another word in terms of themes would be God's reign or God's kingdom. And that's expressed in two different tracks. One track is God, the divine king, the Lord reigns, etc. But the other track is the human kingship, particularly the promises to Abraham and then to David, and the blessings that were come to the nations through Abraham and his descendants, including the kings there. So Book of Judges fits into that second motif that swings through the Old Testament. And of course, when we get to Jesus, he's the king in both senses. He's the divine king by virtue of being the second person of the Trinity, but he's the Davidic king because he's the line of David, and that's what's blessed through the Old Testament. So those things all converge in the person of Jesus. Yes. No, let me ask her first and then come to you.
Could you give us a definition of apostasy?
Definition of apostasy. It's hard to define it. I know it when I see it. But it's a radical turning away from God. An apostate person is one who's rejected God, turned their back on him. Apostasy is that condition in which people live in that state. Okay.
I was just going to point out in Hebrews 11, it does mention both Gideon and Samson.
So we're good. Yep, at least those four. Yep. Rahab is in there too. Okay. It's good. Thank you. Yeah, somebody ask a question that somebody else will answer. That'll be good. Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah. You go ahead, then you're next.
I'm just fascinated. You called yourself.
Yeah.
And then your transformation.
Well, sadly, probably there's still parts of me that are Pharisaical, right? But in terms of, thinking that I would never do those things, thinking I was going to be the good kid, not that. Looking back as an adult, thinking, well, why was it that they kept doing that? And I came up with those three. That list is not found in the Bible itself, but that's my interpretation. What were some of on the human level, what were some of the motivators for them? I don't think they were just saying, we want to disobey God for the sake of disobeying God. Sometimes there were that, but more often it was more like, oh, we like this, and we're going to leave God behind. Okay? Yes?
My question relates a little bit of, how to track, but, this is something to do with the Old Testament. God selecting kings, in the case of Jehu, in kings where God commands Jehu to destroy Ahab's lineage.
Right.
And then in book of Hosea, he condemns him for carrying that punishment in Israel.
Okay.
How do we understand that?
That's one of the hard texts that I'm not going to answer. Any other questions? Well, no, seriously. I mean, seriously, in some ways, we don't know. For example, in the New Testament, it's part of God's plan that Jesus should be betrayed and executed. That was part of the plan. And yet, when the time came, and Judas was the one that carried that out, he was held responsible. So I think the same kind of logic, same kind of mystery is maybe in some of those things. That's all I know. All right, I think it's time. Thank you.